Good afternoon, everyone. We'll be starting shortly. Good afternoon, everyone. We're just waiting for some more people to log in. We'll be starting in 1 minute. Thank you. Right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I think especially to those who I haven't yet spoken to, I'd just like to say Happy New Year to you all. Thank you very much for joining this seminar, or webinar rather. I'm unhappy that we still have to meet solely using a virtual platform, but in this case it's probably helpful as we can reach out to as many people as we can on such an important topic. So on behalf of the CLA, I'm delighted to welcome you to our webinar today. My name is Michael Valencia. I'm the RD for the Southeast and your chair for today. This is the first of two events on this topic that we are running in the Southeast. The second is planned in order to ensure as many of our members as possible get the chance to listen to what is probably one of the most important changes in the sector for many years, as I'm sure you appreciate. As many of you know, Defra has now published its Agricultural Transition Plan. It sets out the UK government's plan for the new agricultural policy in England. Again, some of you will recall that the CLA first proposed a public money for public goods model quite a few years ago now, and we think that the environmental land management schemes is a world-leading policy that will have significant potential to our sector. However, the transition to the new scheme will be a challenging period and we need clarity as many times. We've been fully engaged with Defra on your behalf, and today we're very lucky to have our own expert, Susan Twining, together with a very senior Defra official, Tim Mordan, to provide further transparency. So I should remind you that we're recording this webinar for future use, including to all our members. The format, as ever with our webinars, keep your microphones and videos muted throughout the webinar. We'll soon commence with a poll followed by our two speakers. Do please feel free to ask questions at any time using the questions button below. And of course, we'll then attempt to answer as many of those questions as possible at the end. There are a lot of people on the webinar today, so I would ask, if at all possible, just place a subject matter heading at the top of your question. This way we can group together as many similar questions as possible and therefore hopefully answer more of them. Thank you. The program today, there's the first poll. First of all, if you can answer that, that would be great. Thank you. The program today, as you can see, is very, very simple and straightforward. As I said, we will have a second poll at the end. These are the results at the moment, so it's fairly equal between the plans and those who haven't. And I'm sure our speakers will talk about this more as we go on. Okay, lastly, if you do require assistance during the webinar, do please feel free to contact Pip, our events manager, either via chat or give her a call. Thank you. Now to the more important part of the event, I'll hand over to Tim.
Well, thank you very much, Michael. And hopefully you can all hear me okay. And thanks very much for inviting me along to this session this afternoon. So I was just intrigued by the results of the poll just now, because it looked remarkably like the Brexit vote, which brought back some memories for me. So you've seen my bio. Just to say a little bit more, I've been in Defra and indeed MAF for most of my career. And so I had various roles, and for about the last 5 or 6 years, I've been part of the Agri-Food Chain Directorate, and my particular area has been dealing with food chain. So I look after quite a broad area of activities there. But so some of the areas I'll be touching on in my slide are areas I know quite a lot about, and I'll flag those up. Other areas, for example, ELM, I know a bit about, and happy to try and answer questions. But if I can't answer the questions, rather than give you a duff steer, I will say so, and we'll take them away. And the important thing is just to flag up the questions. And we've got somebody from Defra on the line as well, I think, who will be making a note of all these questions, so we'll certainly take them away. So I was interested in what you said in your introduction there, Michael, that about the CLA's position on future agriculture once we had the referendum result through, because you're absolutely right. I was going to mention this as well, that for some years the CLA has been talking about public money for public goods. So you know, that for us was always a good starting point, and we've over the past few years we've worked very well together, and I certainly work with Susan Twining, who'll be talking after me, very closely. So let's get cracking through my slides. I'll whiz through these fairly quickly, then hand over to Susan, then we'll take questions after. So in the style of Chris Whitty, next slide, please. So this is I won't read that out. We can go straight on to the next slide. But they're the broad areas that I wanted to cover. So Michael mentioned the document that was launched on the 30th of July last year, the Path to Sustainable Agriculture, an Agricultural Transition Plan, and that set out in some detail what the direction of travel would be like for the next few years. And of course, that was the culmination of lots of work and lots of co-design with farmers, landowners, and others in the food supply chain, following the large consultation back in the start of 2018. That was the Health and Harmony consultation, where we had over 40,000 people respond to that. So the announcement on the 30th of November set out in some detail the future plans. It mentioned about how direct payments will be reduced, and I'll come on to that in a moment. It also explained how farmers can and landowners can run a profitable enterprise, and it's not just about ELM. Now, I know that we've done lots of these discussions around the country, and we've joined in plenty of stakeholders talks and discussions, informal and more formal. And one of the bits of feedback we do have is that we need more information, and we absolutely take that on board, and we want to provide some more information as soon as possible. So I've logged that one. I know that's an issue, and we want to issue some more detail as soon as possible. I would just say two things in response to that question. One is that whilst accepting that's an absolutely fair point, you need to plan. Everyone needs to plan. We are, trying to operate a different model in terms of designing the future policy, which is one of co-design and partnership, rather than just the government explaining what must be done and perhaps getting it wrong. So that invariably means that we can't do everything at once. It takes some time. Some of this will emerge over the coming weeks, months, and so on. And the other thing, which was quite interesting, which I did mention to Michael and Susan earlier, was that just before Christmas I was in some farmer discussion groups, and they said, well, of course the announcement at the end of July was all very well, but it's far too much information for us to take in, and too much detail there, and we need some explanation of what it all means. So but I think I'm with you that we need some more information, and you need some more information. We'll do that as quickly as we can. So I'm assuming that most of you are very familiar, or have you at least glanced at or read the document that accompanied the announcements at the end of November. So the idea is that we'll be supporting farmers and land managers to do those things on the slide there: improve the environment, improve animal health and welfare, contribute to net zero targets, and make businesses sustainable. And at the bottom there, we're making changes from this year up until 27. When we did the big consultation back in 2018, seems a long time ago, we had some really lively discussions. There was a fair amount of people who said, we're leaving the EU, just stop direct payments, get rid of everything, all the legacy of the EU Common Agricultural Policy straight away. But our ministers, it was mainly Michael Gove in the chair, Secretary of State at that stage, was keen that given the nature of farming and land management, there needed to be a longer transition. So it's over a 7-year period. So if we move on to the next slide. The announcement mentioned that sort of some general principles here, whereas the EU Common Agricultural Policy was renowned for very much prescriptive, top-down rule setting, fairly, heavy on bureaucracy, very strict enforcement. It was very difficult for us in Defra because we would try to, whenever we tried to exercise some flexibility in how the Common Agricultural Policy was enforced, we were met with EU lawyers who would tell us we'd got it wrong and therefore fine us, which meant there was less money to give back to farmers. So we couldn't really win. Whereas we're trying to move to a more collaborative approach, hence the co-design I mentioned earlier. And this is part of it, listening, trying to make sure we get it right, more flexible approach, and trying to create I'd describe it as a rather more grown-up relationship with farmers, actually. So if we move to the next slide. They're the guiding principles, which you can read yourself. The third bullet point is quite important, and that's something that comes through again and again. How can we earn people's trust in our systems and approach? So we are trying to do as much direct engagement as we possibly can with stakeholders, with farmers groups, with people right throughout the supply chain, just to try and explain what what people have said and what ministers have decided to do, and just try and come up with an agricultural policy for the future which actually suits us in England rather than one that's forced upon us by the EU. So if we move on to the next slide, one of the areas, not surprisingly, that is of most interest to a lot of the farmers that we speak to is about the reductions in direct payments. So this is a chart which is reproduced from the Agricultural Transition Plan document, which just explains how the reductions in direct payments will pan out over the next few years. So I'm sure that most of you are familiar with that. So for the 2021 scheme, up to 30,000, it's a 5% reduction, and that gradually the reduction increases over the next few years. So, for example, if you were a farmer receiving £5,000 direct payment for 21, that would be reduced by £250 to 4,750. Then the following year, the 20% would be £1,000, so 4,000, and then by 24, it would be 50%. So if your BPS was 5,000, obviously it would be 2,500. So that's just illustrative of how the reductions will be made. And for the at the bottom of the table, where the amounts are of BPS being paid are greater, the reductions are greater in the early years, then they sort of flatten out a bit for the following years. If you can move on to the next slide, please. These are quite detailed points, which I'll gloss over a little bit, but as part of the direct payments, we want to do some simplification. So we heard loud and clear lots of complaints about some of the greening rules, which were part of the EU regime, for example, the 3 crop rules. So I think that was announced back in July last year that will go. And there's some other bits and pieces like the ecological focus areas where which were deemed to be quite restrictive, that we want to remove, and also the entitlement usage rule, which is where farmers have to cash in their BPS with every 1 year in 2. So we're going to iron out some of those, and also the last one there about force majeure, which is where farmers often miss the deadline and or for other reasons can't put in their application in the way that the EU rules set out, and we want to introduce a bit more flexibility around that by, for example, increasing it to 8 weeks. But that's some detail in there, which is all in the document, but there'll be more coming. So if we move on to the next slide, one of the key features of the changes to direct payments is set out on this slide about delinking the payments, delinking payments, so it's removed from the requirement to farm the land in due course, and that will happen from 2024. And the other important point to note on that slide is the looking to offer a one-off lump sum payment for farmers who may decide that this is not for them. It allows a bit of room for new blood into the industry. So the idea is that a one-off lump sum, which would comprise a few years of BPS, could be cashed in. And that, again, that's set out in the document, but there'll be some more details in due course. Next slide, please. So there's a lot of interest in environmental land management, and that seems to be the area where the feedback so far is we need more details, and that's absolutely right. They are the 6 main principles of what we're trying to achieve the outcomes we want to achieve with ELM, environmental land management. And a while back, I did just glance at some of the old documents that the CLA had, I say old, it's only a couple of years ago, produced about what their vision of public money for public goods was, and it's not dissimilar to that list there. It was an area of quite lively debate about what constitutes a public good following the consultation in 2018, and that's what we have settled on. So if you move on to the next slide, please. So hopefully some of you are quite familiar with the 3 levels. We originally started calling them tiers, and for obvious reasons, we weren't terribly keen on the word tier. So we changed them to 3 levels. But the first one is sustainable farming incentive. So these are the simple actions that will help all farmers achieve environmental outcomes. So it's all the building blocks, the foundations for improving, enhancing, maintaining the environment. Then the next level up is local nature recovery. So this is more aimed at landowners, and that's locally targeted environmental goals where there might be an element of collaboration, and that's something we want to encourage. Then the upper tier, the upper level, as it were, would be landscape recovery, which are more ecosystem based, much longer term, probably more complex, more challenging to administer, to run, to measure outputs and so on. Again, and they would be for all land managers. So they're the 3 building blocks, again, which we will be providing more details on soon, but I can sketch out some of the timings later if you wish. Can we move on to the next slide, please? They're the key timings, but I'll skate over these a little bit because I don't want to spend too much time running through the slide pack. So if you can move on to the next one, Michael. Countryside stewardship, there's some questions there. I mean, the countryside stewardship, I'm sure many of you are familiar with that. So that will remain open to new applications until 2023. You know, there's a lot of good, the feedback was there's a lot of good features with CS that we want to keep. So we want to run that in parallel and sort of blend it into ELM as much as we can. And next slide, please. And there's woodland creation as well. I mean, that'd be certainly of interest to a lot of your members. Alongside that, we in the document there's mention of a tree health pilot where we want to do more to try and reduce the impact of tree pests and diseases to maintain forests. So that's in the document as well. If we can move on, Michael. That's the tree health scheme that I mentioned. And the next slide. Farming protected landscapes. Again, that's just to flag up that you know, we're going to be given some details about the offer we can, the support offer through areas of outstanding natural beauty and national parks. Then moving on. So there's quite a lot of slides there about ELM, but this slide is actually quite important because, and we probably should have given a bit more detail here, so I'm happy to say more about this later on if anybody wants me to, about the suite of other things that we're doing to try and improve profitability, productivity, competitiveness. So there's a farming investment fund, which we'll be launching later this year. There's actually two bits to it, a small grant scheme and a larger grant scheme. We want to offer some support to farmers. This isn't sort of propping up businesses which are going to fail, but just you know, the feedback was that we really need to make sure farmers know how to shape their businesses. So we've already done a pilot, and we want to roll out a farming resilience fund. There's more work we want to do on the animal health and pathway, health and welfare pathway. Then a lot more on innovation, research and development, where we want to do more farmer-led research in addition to the existing program of public funded research we have. We know that slurry storage and slurry management has been a problem. So we want to have a grant scheme that encourages proper slurry management through a grants. And also we're currently working with you and lots of others on what a new entrant support scheme would look like. So this is how county farms, for example, and other large landowners can really sort of create some space for some innovative new farmers. We tend to say new farmers rather than young farmers because you haven't got to be young to get into the industry. Next slide, please. So the idea is that by the end of the transition in 2027, we'll have a reformed regulatory approach for agriculture. There was a couple of years ago, Dame Gladys Stacey did a review, which again, I'm sure most of you are familiar with, on the regulatory framework that we ought to be adopting. So that's something that we'll be we're looking at the moment. Next slide, please. So do sign up for the e-alert if you haven't done so already, just to keep in touch with the latest news. There's lots of information that's already come out. There's lots more to come out. There's some informal events. There's lots more of informal and formal events are going to come out. There's consultations that are going to come out. So all of these can be flagged up if you sign up to the e-alert. And that slide is just to sort of emphasize the fact that we are trying to do as much engagement with stakeholders, farming organizations as we possibly can. And I think that's the last slide, Michael, I believe. Yeah, that's just the references to some of the key documents if you haven't already got them. Okay. So I realize I galloped through that at quite a pace. I was very tempted to go off onto all sorts of tangents, talking about things which I find interesting, but I resisted the temptation in the interests of leaving enough time for Susan. So I think most of you know Susan Twining. She's the CLA's Chief Land Use Policy Advisor. We work very closely with her, and I'll hand over to her.
Thank you, Tim. Yeah, thanks for an excellent run through all the forthcoming changes. There's clearly a lot of information to digest. So if you, Michael, if you could move to the next slide, please. And I'd hope that most of you have already looked at all the Defra documentation. I'd also recommend having a look at the CLA members briefing, which is available on the website, the CLA website, which provides a nice succinct overview of all the changes and our analysis and thoughts on what it is. Michael, if you can move on to the next one. I think what's clear is that we're in a process of change rather than there being a single point of change. It's going to be really important to have an understanding of what areas of interest, areas are of interest to you and your business, and keep up with developments. So as Tim has said, there are links to the Defra documents and signing up for the alerts from Defra is a good way of keeping up to date with information. But the CLA will also be publishing key documents and advice on the website and in our weekly e-news when available. So keep an eye out for those as well. Next slide, please. Now, I don't want to repeat what Tim has just run through, but what I do want to do is take a closer look at some of the areas. Firstly, I'm going to look at the realities of the cuts in direct payments, and certainly judging by the poll at the beginning, I think that's a really important message. I'm slightly disturbed because we've been running these meetings since lockdown last in March last year, when we were sort of talking about all the changes coming up. And at that point, I think there was actually more people. It was a different group of people, clearly, but there were more people who'd made plans than there are now. So obviously we've got a different group of people today. But I think the main message is now to think about how, what plans you need to make. So if you go on to the next slide, and the next one, I think, Michael, it is. So once I've looked at the direct payments, I'm then going to look at the business changes, what you should be doing now to get prepared for these changes, and then we'll go to questions. So back to the briefing. Tim set out the cuts that are going to be happening to BPS each year. But because it's such an important area, I thought it was worth just reviewing those in more detail. For many farmers, this is going to be the most significant change. And the payments are going to, BPS payments are going to be phased out over the next 7 years. We know what the cuts are going to look like between now and 2024. They've been set out in the transition plan document, but it would be fair to say they're going to be zero by 2028. So the last 3 years will be a continuation of the reasonably steep cuts. In 2021, there will be progressive cuts. So that means that the proportion of your payment will, the cuts will change depending on which proportion your payments fit into in the first year. And then the subsequent years, there will be a flat rate 15% cut for all recipients, which will be additive. So each year there'll be another 15% cut, which is why by 2024, you get to the higher cuts. So if you go to the next slide, please. So I've set out some examples here for different rates of cuts, just as examples of recipients in the left-hand column, so different amounts and how that will affect it. Go on to the next slide. So after 2020, so in 2021, there will be the progressive cuts, which will have different impacts depending on where you are and the amount that you currently receive, with lower impacts, lower cuts for those with the smaller amounts. Under 30,000, there's only going to be 5% cuts. But as you progress through the years, because it then moves to a 15% cut for everybody and an additive 15% cut every year, by 2024, there will be at least a 50% cut for everybody, and for the larger recipients, significantly more. If you go to the next slide, this is looking at it the other way. So just taking an example of how the cuts might look each year, they're obviously ramping up. So somebody who's receiving 10,000 now will be in receipt of 5,000 in 2024. And then in the larger recipient, so if you're in receipt of £160,000 BPS now, then that will be down to 62,000 by 2024. So none of these are insignificant sums for any business to adapt to, whatever the size or makeup. And I think what's clear is that there are some businesses that are more likely to be affected, those that are more reliant on farming income, and in sectors such as commodity cereals and grazing livestock, which are more likely to be affected. Because the reality is, across all sectors, only 25% of farming enterprises are profitable without direct payments. If you move to the next slide, please. So Defra has produced an impact assessment in 2019. It's called the Defra Evidence Compendium. It's actually a great document. It's really well set out and just, it's rammed full of great statistics for all sorts of purposes. So it's one of my Bibles that I keep going to. It's based on survey data and is averaged for different farm types and sizes and tenure. So there isn't really any, so while it's a useful information, there's no shortcut in looking at the impacts for your own business. And I think what's clear is that the figures are challenging, even in the impact assessment here, in the evidence compendium, the figures are challenging, and which makes it even more important to take stock now and make plans to address the cuts in direct payment and looking at other opportunities. I think it would be worth saying that the CLA had advocated a delay in the start in the cuts to direct payments to align better with the introduction of the ELM scheme and to align with the devolved nations as well, and also for shallow cuts in the early years. And one of our principles was that there should be no more than 25% cuts by 2024. So clearly the cuts are a lot steeper than we would like to have them seen. Having said that, as Tim was pointing out, there are a number of other policies which are being brought in to help smooth this transition, so it isn't such a cliff edge for businesses. So if you go on to the next slide, Michael. So these are the number of programs that are due to be introduced between 2021 and 2024. And I think one of the important ones is the Farm Resilience Programme that is looking to be introduced probably sometime later this year. And that's going to provide funded advice for businesses who need to look at their business and understand what needs to change, what could change. So that will be, it won't necessarily be available to everybody, but it'll certainly be available to some people from middle of this year. The other area that will help to smooth the transition between now and 2024 is the early introduction of the Sustainable Farming Incentive. That's being called Sustainable Farming Incentive 2022 because it's expected to be introduced then, and that will provide payments for some of the way that you're farming the land. So it's going to help to support that the things that you're doing that deliver public benefits in the way that you manage the land, that you manage your farmland. And that's currently in development, in very rapid development, I would say. And I can say more about that in questions later. The other thing, as Tim has mentioned, is the Farming Investment Fund, which will provide small grants and large grants for investment to help drive productivity. There's also a slurry investment scheme as well for those who are in dairying and beef that maybe need to upgrade your systems. And of course, there's still the Countryside Stewardship Scheme, and CLA are certainly advocating as looking at the Countryside Stewardship, if you're not in it already, or if you're coming out of an old scheme, looking at going into Countryside Stewardship as a way of moving in and getting experience in order to start delivering into the more challenging ELM programme from 2024. Alongside that, there's plans to develop a new entrance scheme, which is focusing on council farms and how landowners can then work to provide sort of movement of council farms beyond their tenancy, and also innovative new ways of developing of creating tenancies and other ways of getting new entrants into farming. And then there's the potential for a lump sum exit scheme, which is going to be consulted on sometime this year, but it's hoping to be introduced from 2022. We will move to the next slide, please. Well, of course, there's ELM, which the ELM scheme is the flagship. That's coming in full from 2024. There's been a huge amount of work done up till now, even though it still feels like there's lacking in detail. I think as we move into the pilot phase in 2021 and into 2022, there will be more information coming through that will help people plan in more detail about how ELM might work and their ELM might work in their farms. And we've also got the early introduction of some parts of the Sustainable Farming Incentive in 2022. If you move to the next slide, please. I think focusing on what's in the Agriculture Transition Plan is one element, but we should always be thinking about the wider rural economy. Many of CLA members have diversified businesses, and in the past there's been funding through the structural funds through the rural development funding, like LEADER and the Growth Programme. And those funding are moving into a new programme called the UK Share Prosperity Fund, and that's expected to be available sometime after 2022. And we're working with the developers of that to ensure that there is a focus on rural needs as well as others. Go to the next slide, please. This is really just to highlight. There's a lot of change in policy driven by the Agriculture Act, which is what's driving the change in policy. But there's also the Environment Act, or it will be the Act sometime in 2021, and the Climate Change Act and the Net Zero target. They're the main legislative drivers, but there's any number of strategies and policies coming through in the next over the next year or two, which will shape policy and how new markets work. Michael, if you can just click on twice again. There's also the trade agreements with the EU, and there will be time to understand the impacts of that. And then there's also new third country agreements as well, which will have an impact on where the markets are and what competition we might be facing. And of course, there's the impact of COVID-19 on the economy and how that might impact on future budgets, which is still relatively unclear. So I think if you move to the next slide, Michael, there are other opportunities, and we must be careful not to focus solely on what schemes there are available, and take stock about all of the farming assets and consider how to make a profitable business into the future. This might involve changing the farming enterprises, both in what you farm and how you farm, such as rationalising the machinery and labour, looking at different crops, more collaboration with neighbours, or a completely different management system. But it might also be looking at wider opportunities in the environmental market, such as carbon or biodiversity net gain, which are going to be driven through the Environment Act and the Climate Change Act. And there's also a real drive for clean energy, as we saw in the Prime Minister's 10-point plan back in November and the Energy White Paper that came out in December. And so they'll be looking at reduced emissions. There's going to be opportunities for biomass and for trees in sequestering carbon. I think it's worth noting, just as an aside, it's worth noting that despite the titles of the Defra documents and many of the scheme names, like the Farming Investment Fund, there is actually a lot for forestry and woodland in the transition plan. And I think it's worth looking at the detail of what there is for forestry and woodland as well. And importantly, it is actually featuring in all parts of the environmental land management scheme as well. So there's also looking at the opportunities again, even wider still, are opportunities for diversification or off-farm work, if that's what is needed to improve the profitability of your business. I think what is key though is that all farm businesses are unique, and so there is no one solution for any particular business. It's very unique to that business. So in summary, so that we can quickly move on to the questions, it's important that we can no longer rely on the direct payment type of income. And bear in mind that only 25% of farming enterprises are profitable without direct payments as they currently stand. I think the Defra stats were from 2018. So looking at the farming business is a really important part of the assessment for the future. In England, direct payments are going to be cut from this year. So the payment in December will be the first one that will be getting cut. And there is this bit of a gap between now and 2024 before ELM is fully available. I think another point is that we've only got funding levels guaranteed up until the end of this Parliament in 2024. So it's vital that we can demonstrate that we can actually deliver on some of the requirements under the sustainable farming incentives, so that we can continue to get funding into the future. So I think the actions now, I think it's absolutely imperative to ensure that the core business is sound without direct payments. That's the #1 priority. But be ready to look at other opportunities from policies and market opportunities, the grants that are available, looking at what the Environmental Land Management Scheme can contribute, where trees might fit in, energy, carbon, diversification, doing things differently, such as collaboration. And I think be ready for change. Few businesses are going to be untouched by these changes. And I think finally, I'd just like to say that at the CLA, if you just click onto the next slide, Michael, the CLA are ready to provide advice. We provide advice through the Land and Business magazine. We provide telephone advice through the regional and national teams. And we've got any number of guidance notes that are there to help you work your way through these changes. We're also working, as Tim said, we're also working closely with Defra in all different departments and with BEIS and other departments as well, looking at the policy development and ensuring that we're shaping the future policy in the right way and achieving the changes that we need to support your businesses. So that's all I have just now. I think we're now going to go on to questions. So I'll pass back on to Michael.
Okay, thanks, Susan. You stay where you are. Tim, let's get you back on stage, if that's okay. Thank you. Right, so some good questions appearing, but I'm going to start off with a very simple one of my own, Tim, and it's for you, which is, so we've got some clarity now on the sort of BS side, but there's a bit of a knowledge gap between that and still. So what next? You know, what are the next stages to get to ELMS and to get to clarity on ELMS? Yeah,
okay, and I kind of touched on that at the beginning of my presentation, Michael, and accepted that you're looking for more information. And in some ways, it's unfortunate that this webinar isn't a month or two later, because hopefully would they be talking about what was in the detail that we'd issued. But at the moment, we haven't sent that out yet. We haven't got the, we're still doing the co-design. I mean, the key timings are early on in this year, we want to start recruiting for the national pilot. So that can operate on the ground from late this year through to 24, when, as Susan mentioned, that's when the full ELM will take off. So on the SFI pilot, that hopefully we'll be sending something out fairly soon. I don't have an exact date, but you know, certainly a month or two, I would hope, which will invite expressions of interest for the SFI. And then that will be followed by formal applications in the summer. And then the pilots would start in the autumn, and the first phase will focus on people who are already in RPA. Then for LNR, that will be slightly behind. So the pilots will begin in 22, and then for the landscape recovery, the pilot would be sort of more on that time scale. So, you know, like the LNR. So that's the kind of broad timings. So I can't give a precise date of when we're going to send out the details, because there's a lot to work out still, and a lot of data from the test and trials to analyze before we're ready to do so. But Susan might want to just add to that.
No, I think it's, I think I sort of share the frustration. There's lots of information, but little detail in some of these areas. I think the timescales are something to hold on to, and certainly we will be sort of promoting when things do change. So the pilots are going to be the initial phase, and once the pilots start running, we'll get a much clearer shape and view of what the future ELM scheme will look like. But obviously, as I said at the beginning, this is a process of change. And while the pilots are going to start giving us some view of what they might look like and how they might operate, there will be quite a few changes that will happen as the learning happens during the pilots before it's fully launched in 2024.
Okay, thank you. We'll just stick with ELMS for the time being. There's a question here from, I'm sorry, I don't know your full name. It's M.A. Piper and Son Farms. There are two parts to it. I suggest the second one perhaps is you approach the CLA directly, and we can get our tax department to answer that. But the first bit is looking at the three levels of ELMS. Is carbon auditing likely to be a prerequisite for all levels and tiered depending upon which level you are aiming at? I suppose, Tim, that's for you initially.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Well, I mean, the tests and the trials which we've been carrying out for a couple of years now, I guess. I mean, they were designed to look at the broad range of environmental outcomes that we want. So for SFI, the kind of it's a bit pejorative to call it entry level, because it's not like that, but it's for everyone. There might be an element of that, but you know, I know that, I mean, Susan's probably in some ways better tuned into this than me to answer this one, but certainly for the LNR and landscape recovery, you know, we want it to contribute towards net zero. So that's and the 25-year environment plan. So that's, you know, and that includes a number of ways of measuring carbon capture.
Yeah, so, I mean, I think it hasn't been decided how it will be. Certainly the development of the sustainable farming incentive, which is where a lot of the farming savings will go, are tending to be embedded in actions. So it wouldn't necessarily require a carbon footprint or a carbon audit. It will just be about doing things, because in some ways,
yeah,
you know, doing a carbon audit doesn't necessarily you don't need to do a carbon audit to know what you need to do in order to sequester more carbon or to reduce your carbon emissions. There's a lot of information about how you can do that without ever doing a carbon audit. So it might still be important at the higher levels. That's still to be decided.
But I think it's worth saying that I mean, I think that's right. I think it's confirmed what I said, Susan. But one of the advantages of having our own policy, of course, is that we haven't got something prescriptive that's set in stone for 7 years. And as people get used to SFI and then ELM, it might be a feature of all environmental schemes in the future. But we wouldn't start off, overly ambitious.
Let's stick with a couple more about ELMs, and then we'll move on to perhaps some funding questions. First one from Maria Spink is healthy soil recognised as one of the 6 principles under ELM? And if so, how is that calculated or defined?
Yeah, well, again, Susan's probably far more close to the detail than me on this one, but soil health is definitely one of the features.
Yeah, there's a very movable feast at the moment. We know that one of the standards within the Sustainable Farming Incentive is looking at, well, there's 2 standards, one on arable soils and one on grassland soils. And there's a number of measures within those that will be about building up soil health. And within each of the standards, there are 3 different levels that you could go to. So there will be actions. I don't have the details right in front of me, but there are actions. And at some point, the development of the Sustainable Farming Incentive is going at some pace at the moment within Defra, and also consultative. So we had worked with Defra on workshops before Christmas, and we've got another one tomorrow where we're including members' input into it as well. And I think at some point it will be at a point very soon where we can actually start, there'll be more information available about these standards that we can share with more people. But at the moment, it's not particularly clear what will or won't be in. So if I told you what was in the ones in December, because of the feedback that we gave, it may have changed. But the message is that soil health is there under arable soils and grassland soils.
Yeah, and it's also part of some of the other 6 themes around thriving plants and wildlife and adaptation to climate change and so on. So it's part of that as well.
Okay, thank you. The last one on ELMS so far, anyway. And Tim, you're the tip of the spear again, I'm afraid. Many of the activities to receive support under ELMS will not satisfy the definition of agriculture for tenancy agreements or tax purposes. Is Defra considering the need form of this, either within or outside the tenancy reform group?
I'm not quite sure I grasped the question, but is it about whether tenants would have access to to all the schemes?
I think it's more that if the tenant, a lot of tenancy requirements are that they're farming, that they're producing crops and livestock, and if they're moving into environmental land management, that may be a breach of their tenancy agreement. I think the tax situation is the same. So so with the tax one, if you put more than 50% of your income starts coming from environmental land management, does that affect your tax status? Which is something that I'll just answer that one. We've got a meeting with HMRC in a couple of weeks' time with Louise Speak, who's the Chief Tax Advisor, where we're raising this issue. And there was also a question earlier on about the tax treatment of lump sums, and we're going to be raising that one as well, because it's absolutely critical to get those rights. Otherwise, the tax system will be fighting, the policy system, and we can't have that.
Yeah, and I noticed.
Just to jump in, I think there's just perhaps some confusion over this area generally, because there's a question from Frank Lucas as well, or statement, who says, please comment on the implications for landlord-tenant relationships arising from the agricultural transition plan.
Yeah, well, this was when the bill was going through Parliament. This was a live issue, of course, about the extent to which tenants can have access to the various schemes. And I think ministers, as the bill went through Parliament, were absolutely clear that tenancy is it makes up, I think it's about a third of the farmed land in this country, in England, and it's absolutely vital, and we want them to have access to it. I mean, the finer points about tax are difficult because it is HMT territory. In fact, I think there's a debate coming up in the House of Lords next week on this very issue. So we are engaging with Treasury on that. But it's one we can take away. And the issue of whether the lump sums will be taxed is again something that I don't have the clear answer, yes or no. I'm sure it's more sophisticated answer than that, but it's already been logged. It's been mentioned many times, and it's one we're a live issue that we're looking at.
And I think the point with that one is that there probably needs to be quite a quick decision. So if people are thinking about taking lump sums, the planning for that needs to happen now, and nobody will even consider it until there's clarity on the tax front. So it is quite it's a very important area to sort out as soon as possible.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Okay.
There are a couple of questions involving countryside stewardship, but before homing in on that, just a couple on sort of funding generally. From Bridget Bedell. Tim mentioned about farming in protected landscapes. I understand AONB and national parks are shortly to be in receipt of some funds, but how are farmers to access these? I believe they are going to be received by the AONB.
Sorry, what's the AONB? Area of National Beauty. Okay, outstanding natural beauty. Okay, yeah.
Enough. I've been talking to a couple of members about this particular area.
Okay. Well, this is not my particular area of expertise. I can find out more, and through Susan try and delve a bit more and see if I can find the answer, rather than offer something that it turns out to be wrong. But I know it's in the 30th of November document. It's in there as funding will be available for AONBs and national parks. So, but I don't think we have any more details on that at the moment. Okay,
Susan, can you add anything to that?
No, I think it's very much in development at this stage about how that's going to operate. But the assumption would be that the national parks and AONBs would be in charge of the money and working with people within their boundaries to work out how best to spend that money and to support the transition.
Okay, I've lost the other question, I'm afraid. I'm sorry, on funding, but so I'll move to a few questions on countryside stewardship. One from Annie Brown. How soon might Defra move to offer countryside stewardship on a rolling monthly basis, as HLS used to be, rather than a calendar year start? We'd like to sign up to the new CS scheme, but our current agreement ends 31st January, which means that we're effectively stuck with HLS extensions until you do.
Yeah. Well, at the moment, I think my understanding is that we want to, make sure that countryside stewardship and the best features of it continue. And as I mentioned in my presentation, kind of running in parallel to the development of ELM. So if there's any flexibility we can put in there about application periods and rolling programs, then I think the ambition is to do that, but we don't have a clear answer on that at the moment.
Okay, thanks. I attended a committee meeting last year, towards the end of last year, where one of the members did recommend that people do sign up to countryside stewardship as much as possible in terms of trying to cover the gap. And Andrew Murison has sort of emphasised that. He said, is it expected that applications to countryside stewardship over the transition will breach the funding gap in line with the fall in direct payments?
Yeah, I mean that's a something we hear all the time. I think it's it's important to look at the whole package as exactly that, as a whole, rather than think it's just about ELM and will I get enough money from ELM to make up the reduction in BPS. If you look through the suite of measures, and as I said, we probably should have spoken more about some of the bits on the slide around productivity and profitability. There are other measures that farmers and landowners can tap into, like the Farm and Investment Fund, which somebody's asked about, and so on. So it's not just about ELM.
I would agree, and I think the sustainable farming incentive will go part way. all the money that is being removed from, taken back in hand from the cuts in direct payment are being recycled into the industry, and we'll trust Defra to do that. But it's not going to be recycled direct into the same way back into every business. So there will be changes in the way it is distributed. And I think that's what you need to look at. Again, it's about looking at your individual circumstances. So we've done some modelling looking at what sustainable farming incentive might contribute, and we think that might cut the cut in direct payments by maybe up to 50% on some farms, depending on how much the payment rate is, but it is not going to replace all of that. So that's why you might want to also add countryside stewardship. You might want to look at how you might be able to save costs and look at efficiencies in the way that you're producing as well. And there's no one answer, I'm afraid. But as Tim says, it is really looking at that package of measures and looking outside that, not being reliant on subsidies and payments into the future. There are other market opportunities that may be available to help reduce that risk of being so reliant on payments in the future.
Yes.
Speaking of,
sorry, but I was just going to say, and I'd add to that. I mean, a lot of farmers are just immediately concerned, quite rightly, about well, where will I make up any shortfall in BPS? In addition to what Susan said, there are the money being saved is being recycled, but we're in this for the long term. This is a long-term policy that we don't expect to change very quickly, and so that does include some more strategic, longer-term initiatives, like establishing a Institute for Agriculture and Horticulture, so that we have a thriving, professionalised, attractive sector that people want to come into, which will help. There's lots on research and development that I could talk about if anybody's interested, all of which is recycling the money in a more strategic, longer term way, in keeping with the whole principles that were set out in the document.
I mean, that said, there are some sectors that are probably more concerned than others, and perhaps you'd like to comment on a concern that Nick Jones is reflecting for upland hill farmers. He says, how are upland hill farmers going to cope with these reductions in BPS support, as undoubtedly they rely to a far greater degree on these monies to keep afloat and are far more exposed to commodity price changes? Yeah,
and that's an absolute fair question, and that's one we're looking at, because we know that we've in the evidence compendium that Susan flashed up there, there's lots of evidence there about the different sectors and their reliance on BPS. Some sectors, of course, are reliant at all, poultry and so on, and eggs. Other sectors like sheep, of course, are heavily dependent on BPS, and there's limited scope for them to diversify or move into other enterprises. So we're looking at how they can get the most out of the productivity grants and so on that are going to be on offer.
I would just say on the impact assessment, the evidence compendium is great. There's a lot of information in there, but I do think it feels like there needs to be more of an impact assessment now. We know more what the shape of ELM is going to be and what sort of income levels it's going to be available. Just an impact assessment done in 2018, 2019, before we really knew even the shape of ELM, I think needs to be revised to really understand how that's going to affect. And I know, there is work going on that, but I think it'd be really helpful to see that and have a greater clarity on what the impacts might be.
Yeah, thank you. There are two questions I'd like to address, which are perhaps a bit broader. One of them is about public goods, which is it's quite an incidence of the rights of way we have to provide, not a public good. Use has changed enormously, as have users' attitudes. Horse businesses run on the basis of rights of way and not using their own land for exercise. We receive nothing positive in return. Helping with fencing would be good too. There's a little apocryphal bit. One day I stood between two horse people with land adjacent to the rights of way, both telling me I should make it much wider. Neither suggested doing it on their land and then asking me to do the same. where I manage both sides. Yeah, Susan, perhaps you might like to comment on this.
Sorry, Michael, who's that to?
Sorry, if you might comment on that first, Susan.
Yeah, sorry. I was scrolling through the other question. Sorry. Yeah, I mean, we've had huge amounts of problems with access over the lockdown period, and amazing pictures, problems of the footpaths broadening. But I think the principle of where there's already a right of way, it's not necessarily classed as a public good. Permissive footpaths may well be classed as a public good, and that's still something that will be access generally through environmental land management scheme is likely to be quite highly sought after. It's not right in all situations though, or for all people. So I think we would be advocating that any permissive access would need to be voluntary. I think the arguments around existing, the rights of ways that are already there and that are mandated, so non-permissive rights of way, I think are very difficult actually, because they are legally laid down. I think where you're maybe improving, there might be arguments around improving the experience, improving the user experience, either by providing car parking or, as you say, maybe some fencing. Then that there may be some arguments there, but I think there's still some way to go on the discussions of those.
Okay, thanks. Tim, just very quick question from you before I'll have one more after that. Just about seasonal and casual labour. When will the new seasonal and casual labour scheme be announced? It's quite important, clearly. For
well, it has been announced on the 22nd of December. It was announced. So I think most people will know that we've relied heavily on seasonal agricultural workers, especially in fruit and veg for many years from Eastern Europe. And we've had a pilot running for the last 2 years, which is just small amounts of non-EU workers coming in. Obviously, things changed dramatically on the 1st of January with the new immigration rules and the points-based system, which meant that there was no longer that free flow of especially, workers from especially Romania and Bulgaria. So on the 22nd of December, we did announce that the pilot would be extended this year and expanded to 30,000 workers, seasonal workers in the fruit and veg, edible fruit and veg sector, edible horticulture, and we are currently recruiting more labour providers, and so hopefully that figure will provide some comfort to the businesses that do rely on seasonal workers. But alongside that, we're also trying to work with all sectors, not just edible horticulture, to look at how we can incentivize more British workers coming onto farms. But I think we all know the problems associated with that, which I'd be happy to explain if I had more time, but we probably won't need to move on.
Okay, Tim, thank you. And thank you to both of you. We've got a poll which we're going to put up now, as promised. So if you wouldn't mind filling that in, I think it's about to come up now. Quite interesting again to see the results here. It'll take you a bit more time, so please be patient, but do please fill it in. I suppose what I'd like to do is start to conclude, and I think certainly what's come out to me, the sort of key messages as have come out to me is effectively to plan ahead. We've got elms coming, we've got countryside stewardship to plug into if possible amongst us. Tim mentioned a whole host of other areas of transition support. And of course we can provide more advice on that. And that's the key thing as well. We are very conscious that it's not an easy time, and the CLA is here to assist. So do please approach us if you need any advice or assistance. And I suppose again, the key message is get involved, get engaged, and plan ahead. Pip, has everyone filled in the poll? Have we got a result? There we go. And we'll pass, I think this data is quite important to pass on to Defra anyway and to Tim. So, of course, we'll do that. But quite interesting. We'll leave it up there for a little bit longer. I hope everyone can see that. They're quite interesting answers. And of course, the Environmental Land Management Scheme, there is much, and a lot of the questions did reflect that. People do want more information on that, and as soon as possible, clearly, to be part of this planning ahead that we talked about. Okay, once again, I'd like to thank both of you for coming on this and for being brave enough to answer questions on a topic that is quite, I suppose, difficult in some ways. Please see our CLA website events page for forthcoming events, and there are quite a lot coming up now, both social and of course professional. Please take part in all of them. It's great to have you on them. The session has been recorded. I'll remind you again. I apologise if questions weren't answered. We will attempt to answer them. They'll be sent to Susan and she'll follow up on those. But as I said, the session has been recorded and will be available afterwards. But otherwise, thank you to everyone for taking part. Bye-bye.